Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's expert webinar series presentation. It is titled Moving Beyond Notice, Driving Meaningful Change and to Foster Inclusion, Equity, and Belonging. And it is presented by Jina Etienne. She's the founder and principal consultant of Etienne Counseling. Well, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Thomas Provine. I'm a marketing coordinator here at Accountants World, and I will be taking care of the MC duties today. For most of you frequent flyers, as it were, of the expert webinar series, you know that my supervisor, Dib Monsali, is usually on with us. He's unfortunately under the weather today, so send your well wishes his way. But we'll have things locked down here, no worries for you guys. It's going to be a great presentation today. Just a couple of quick tips, on GoToWebinar. You can use the orange arrow to expand and hide the panel. You can also toggle the audio options by expanding the audio section to choose telephone or computer speakers, or you can click the phone icon. And you can also expand the questions section, type your question and click send. If you have any technical questions, Sharon is in the background to help answer those. We are highly encouraging today asking questions on the material. I'm sure all of it will be very thought-provoking material that Jina is going to be giving to us today. As most of you know, we will be offering one CPE for today's webinar. For what do you need to know? Well, the three things you need to do in order to get CPE. You need to attend the live webinar for no less than 50 minutes. You need to respond to all of the polling questions during today's webinar. There are 4 polling questions today, so please be sure to answer all 4 of those polling questions. And then you need to submit the post-webinar survey within 24 hours after the webinar has ended. And we will be sending out that CPE in just about 3 business days. So you should be receiving it by end of week at the earliest. We like to get those CPE certificates out soon. So please just remember these things that you need to do for CPE today. Anything else that you need to do, you need to make sure that you add webinar@accountantsworld.com to your trusted email list. Another quick thing while doing the CPE today, it's something we've noticed in GoToWebinar this year. That's a glitch that kind of hasn't been fixed yet. When one of the CPE questions is launched, one of the polling questions is launched, if you're listening in full screen presentation, please minimize your screen, click on the answer that you want, submit so it gets submitted, and then expand the screen back to full screen presentation. For some reason, GoToWebinar isn't tabulating the responses when the attendee is in full screen mode. It's a GoToWebinar issue, but we found a way around it. Just minimize your screen to from full screen mode, click on what you want, and then you can go back to watching the presentation in full screen mode. All right. So we have a free guide for today's attendees. I know some of you that come to the expert webinar presentations regularly know we usually ask a polling question to see if you would like a download. Well, today's book we have in our handouts tab, it's our Emerging Stronger Than Ever guide. And we know that for accountants and payroll providers and whoever is accounting today, that your clients need you more than ever in today's cultural climate and today's climate with COVID-19. So we really want you to reshape and rethink your client relationships and help your practice really thrive for years to come. So this guide is a great way to begin thinking about doing that and implementing change in your practice where we think you can emerge stronger than ever. So if you'd like, please download that guide in the handouts tab. We highly encourage you to read it and reach out to Accountants World if you have any questions about it. So let's begin with our presentation today. So a little bit about Jina. She's the founder of Etienne Counseling. She's a former director of diversity and inclusion at Grant Thornton, and she's one of the foremost experts on firm diversity practice, management, and tax ethics. And we are thrilled to have her today. She's one of my favorite speakers. So without further ado, please welcome Jina Etienne. Jina, how are you?
I am good. Ta-da, I just magically appeared. Now let's see, am I sharing my screen yet?
Not yet. I'm giving you presenter controls right now. Just one second.
Ta-da.
Roger.
Thank you. So I'm excited. Let's see, share my screen. Don't you just love this stuff, this transition of stuff? All right, confirming you can see my presentation.
I am seeing it in organizer view, and I'm also seeing it as an attendee, Jina, so we're ready to go.
Yay, all right. So thank you so much for having me. And I'm smiling Thank you for saying I'm your favorite presenter. That's very kind. So what are we doing today? We are talking about diversity and inclusion. I'm approaching this from the perspective of a CPA firm, particularly a small firm. I think that what we're going to talk about today applies to firms of all sizes. I think that medium and smaller firms, though, are struggling with how do you develop a D&I strategy, and why would we develop a D&I strategy? Because so much of the conversation really talks about it from the perspective of big business, multinational corporations. That tends to be the tone of the things that you see. So what we're going to be talking about today is after you recognize that diversity is important, then what? Then what do you do? So just a little bit about my firm, Etienne Consulting. We offer training. We also offer coaching, and I think coaching is something that's not seen a lot of because if you are a leader in a firm and you're interested in doing diversity work, some of the change is going to have to happen with the way that you think and the way that you approach business and the way that you manage people and understanding what your intentions are, and then how those intentions show up in your actions and your words, and how that then influences the operations, the policies, the standards, the cultural norms inside of the firm. That's a lot. But so those are the types of things that we do. And so I wanted to share that because I'll be infusing that into the presentation. I would encourage you all to ask questions as we go. I know we have a designated Q&A section at the back at the end of the session, but I also know, I'm trying to pull it up now, I also know that sometimes things come up, and if somebody has a question and it'll help me reinforce a point or clarify a point, that's almost more important than finishing the slide deck. And so let's jump in. What are we going to do today? 3 things. First, the why. Why is the business case? Because why, from a humanitarian perspective, while that's nice, I think the reality is we can see some research today and more research every day that shows you why this matters from a business perspective. It puts the numbers on paper. The what is to provide the context. If we don't understand what we're trying to achieve, then developing a strategy is a strategy for strategy's sake. And then the last part, the how, that is just what are the components of a D&I strategy? And I'll give you a preview. There are a lot. No one place is the right place. You can develop a D&I strategy from any of the different steps that I'm going to share, as well as scrap the idea of a strategy and focus on identifying initiatives that will work really well for your firm, for your organization. And so with that, let's jump in. What I want to do is we're going to start with, of course, the why. So how does D&I affect how your firm can perform? Let's start with the business case. And this is the Pennsylvania Institute of CPAs. They put out a report several years ago. It's still very relevant today, and it really provides some very interesting information. What's nice about this is it's specific to the accounting profession. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of research out there. And when the research cites business advantage, opportunities, and how diversity can help a company, those things are all true inside of the accounting profession. But what's nice about this is understanding it from the CPA perspective. And so I would encourage you all to look at this white paper, because it's talking about things like the shifts in the demographics and how those demographic shifts are influencing our clients, our potential recruits, and the business environment. So this report, though, the McKinsey study, this is the one that's cited a lot. You'll find it in a lot of articles. I know I talk about it a lot, as do many other D&I consultants. There's a part here, the quote, in the United States, there's a linear relationship between racial and ethnic diversity and better financial performance. But there's more to that quote, and I just want to read it here. It says, for every 10% increase in racial and ethnic diversity on the senior executive team, earnings before interest and taxes rises 0.8%. Now, they do go on to say that correlation is not causation, But when companies show a demonstrated commitment to D&I, they do see that performance improves, that they are more successful. And diversity, more importantly today, can be seen as a differentiator in the marketplace. And we're not talking about just business, getting new clients, but this is also going to be something, as we'll see, can change the game from a recruiting perspective. And let me just say this now in case I forget. We're working in a COVID world. We are often, most of us anyway, are working from home. I mean, I'm presenting from my home office today. And what's important to think about is the opportunities that this gives us from a diversity perspective. I'm digressing a little bit, but I think it's relevant to this point. Small firms in the United States have particularly struggled with diversity. And if diversity can help differentiate you, then this is an opportunity to start looking across the United States for talent. Let's say you live in an area that's predominantly white, or it's not particularly diverse. If the area is predominantly Black or predominantly Asian or wherever it is, and so the employees that you draw from locally tend to be homogenous. Looking across the United States today, with having employees that live in various areas, you actually have the power and the potential to hire and have a more diverse workforce. There'll be some different issues around how to develop a culture when you are virtual, but developing culture when you're virtual is a very different challenge than culture with regard to ethnicity and business norms, social norms when you're together in a physical office. And so I think that's something that's important to bring up. Also, there's some additional information here that talks about how small businesses that prioritize diversity and inclusion can help with employee satisfaction, which can improve long-term retention. And interestingly enough, here on the second bullet you'll see on this slide, gender diversity can help companies financially outperform their competitors. And so I think that this is really important because so much of the diversity conversation today, particularly post George Floyd and what's been happening, Breonna Taylor, and so many of the other stories that we see in the headlines today, sometimes we tend to narrow our conversation with respect to D&I and focus on ethnicity above all else. And I think that it's important to step back and also look at all of the areas of diversity, which we're going to look at here in a moment. The other thing I wanted to point out, and it's right here on the slide. Sorry guys, I keep looking to the side because I can see the slides over here. What I'm highlighting on the screen is diversity is hard to measure. If we're accountants, and I'm suspecting most of us are, and we like numbers, and that's just our personal collective problem, we tend to want to do things because we can measure it. So for example, think about the billable hour. The billable hour persists today, even though there is increasing evidence and lots of conversation about moving away from the billable hour and moving to something called value billing. And value billing feels less precise. It's not as easy to put a finger on, and we're more comfortable saying this many hours, I'm worth this much per hour. But we really have to move away from this notion that the numbers and the statistics are going to be the only way that we can determine success, because from a diversity perspective, you have to be able to think more broadly. So let's see, the last point that I want to make in this space is as it comes to smaller businesses, and I love this article because what I was just talking about, the tendency of our conversation to narrow, to talk about race, to talk about ethnicity, or to focus on gender, misses an opportunity for us to look at it differently. So generational differences, there's a wonderful LinkedIn report, LinkedIn research. I wish I had it, and in fact, if I remember, Tom, if you remind me, I might be able to share the link to this afterwards. There's this great research that talks about the power of generational diversity because of the way that different generations work together, looking at the superpowers, if you will, the strengths of the different generations, and how when you combine them into a team, that the team can actually be more successful. So generational differences is starting to show up as a way that we can leverage and leverage diversity on our team in what otherwise might be or feel like a homogenous team. So if your team is very similar in ethnicity, even if it's all women or all men, if you look at the different generations on your team, you might be able to leverage that. So this is really about thinking about diversity differently, particularly as a small firm. A small firm statistically tend to be more homogenous. The larger the firm, the more diverse the firm. Although you'll see in a moment, as a profession, we're still not wildly diverse. So before we go any further, this is that first polling question that we want to ask. I don't know.
Okay, here we go. So you should be seeing the poll question on your screen now, and Jina's asking which of these benefits of diversity might be realized by your organization, and select everything that applies: innovation, performance, strategic advantage, something else, or you're just not sure.
And while that's going on, let me just ask an operational question. Am I still on camera?
Not while the poll's open. I think all they see are the poll screen.
Good. So this is the perfect time to sneak some water. The other question, just a reminder, you said something about make sure you minimize your screen, click the poll, submit, then maximize your screen. I'm just reminding the participants to do that, whatever that is.
Yes, thank you. To take it out of full screen view, if they're viewing the presentation in full screen, the poll response doesn't register. But we've got about 90% of the audience who's voted right now, so we'll keep this open for a few more seconds.
Yeah, I'm loving seeing this, the results coming in real time. And it's what I was hoping for. Yay.
All right, we are about 92% here, so give it about another 5 to 10 seconds here.
Things seem to have stabilized, so. Okay, I'm gonna be closing this poll here in 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Here, and I'll share the results for us, Jina.
Yeah.
It seems like innovation is definitely the winner, followed closely by performance and strategic advantage.
That's awesome. I love that. And the reason I love it in particular is so often I've heard, particularly over the last several years, that this is really about recruiting, or that diversity is about retention. And those are very important. But what happens when we focus on the diversity recruiting aspect, it puts the benefits of diversity further down the line. And by that I mean, if we think we need to hire in more diverse talent before we can enjoy the benefits of diversity, then we're missing the diversity that's already in the room. Just like I was talking about a moment ago, that there's a lot of different aspects that we can look at when we're talking about diversity. And don't get me wrong, I think representation is important. So long as leadership is homogenous. And in the CPA profession today, if we look at leadership as partners in CPA firms, they're still, and I wrote the numbers down, I'll double check them later, but they're still 77% male and 91% white. And without representation in the room of more women, without representation in the room of more people of color, then the thinking won't be reflective of what we now know is almost 50% of the people that work in the profession are women. So we're almost 50-50. And we have an increasingly diverse pool of staff. So this innovation that we're looking for, this performance improvements that we're looking for, the ability to leverage diversity as a strategic advantage, that will happen as we start looking more broadly at diversity. I love this quote because when everybody can participate, that's when we can get to the part that we start to see problem solving. So this leads us naturally into the next section of the presentation, which is really about the objectives. What are we doing here? Like, what's the goal? What's the big hairy goal, as they say? And so here I want us to think about those benefits. You all checked the boxes and you said 63% innovation. 61% said performance, 66% said strategic advantage. These are just some of the benefits of diversity in an organization. You also look at that last bullet. I'm sorry, but we have to think about this, particularly as CPAs in a highly regulated environment, whether it's us or the clients that we serve, legal risk and ensuring compliance in the legal environment. This is very important. And thinking back to the days of the when EEOC rules and guidelines and protected groups and all of that regulation came out, that drives a lot of diversity initiatives from a risk aversion perspective. But it's important, and you should not forget this in a D&I strategy. The other one is the second bullet from the bottom, which talks about brand and reputation. And we're starting to see, particularly as millennials get older, millennials are in their 30s, I think, mid to upper 30s now. They are the ones that are driving purchases, not only on the consumer side, but they're increasingly more and more leaders in organizations, and they're making the decisions on who they're going to hire to be their suppliers, to be their accountants, to be their advisors. And they look at diversity differently, and they look to see what a company's commitment is to diversity. So improving diversity can also just help from a brand performance perspective. And so this is very important. Reputation as a service provider, not just reputation as an employer. Here's the trick though. In order for you to enjoy those benefits of diversity, you have to have an inclusive environment. So here, for example, when people with different backgrounds get together and it's a comfortable feeling, when they feel good about that, when it's not tense, they tend to be more productive. When people feel like they fit into an organization, they tend to contribute more. And here's where we're starting to see, and the research supports this, that as much as an 83% increase in innovation. Now, innovation is harder to define. It's one of those things you kind of know it when you see it. But we see an increase in innovation because people feel like they fit in. If people are more comfortable and they feel more confident, then their own engagement in the company is improved. So employee engagement goes up. We also know that 67% of job seekers, and this is what I was alluding to earlier, 67% look at diversity as part of the reason they will go work for an organization, for a firm. And then finally, and I already mentioned this, clients feel more, clients feel as if they're valued, and they value your firm more, not just because of your expertise, but because of your commitment. So community and social responsibility is an increasingly important part of D&I. And I think it's the last piece that's starting to fall into place. The challenge with inclusion, though, is it's hard to measure. And the way I like to frame it is diversity, it's really different. Diversity is the thing that we notice. Inclusion is the way that it feels. And so it's going to be important for us to start to put some language around this and identify what it means so that we can tell when we're talking about diversity or trying to create this feeling of inclusion. So it starts with, and this is the title of this session, it starts with notice. And what I mean by notice is, I mean, what do you see? There's more diversity that's invisible than visible, but it starts with noticing it. And by seeing, I mean, what are you appreciating? Let me share those statistics that I mentioned earlier. So I had to write this down. If we look at accounting students who are enrolling in bachelor's and master's accounting programs, this is the 2019 AICPA Trends Report data. Enrollees are roughly 50-50 men and women, but 56% white. When we go all the way to those who are graduates, it's still 50-50 women, but now it's 59% white. When we start to look at those graduates that are hired into CPA firms, still about 50-50 men and women, but now it's 70% white. When we look at all professional staff in a CPA firm, the gender balance is starting to shift just a little bit. 53% men, 47% women, 71% white. When we start to look at those staff and say, let's just look at the CPAs, and now it's 58% men to 42% women and 84% white. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when we finally just filter out and look just at the partners in CPA firms, 77% men, 91% white. So that tells us that we have an opportunity when we look at the enrollees in accounting today to be more diverse. To be fair, this is also a question of timing, because if they're enrolling today, it's going to take a few years for them to graduate and to work their way into CPA firms. But this is a long game. And so we want to be thinking about it from that perspective. And when I talk about diversity, that's all I'm talking about is different. And so understanding what we mean by that, because we have to be careful, we're starting to throw out the terms diversity and inclusion in a way that it might feel like it's becoming a platitude. So we want to make sure that when we're referencing diversity, we're referencing it clearly and identifying and defining what we mean when we say diversity. When we talk about inclusion and how we measure success is interesting. And I found this article, and what I found fascinating about this article is that there's this notion that when we achieve critical mass, when we have enough underrepresented minorities, then we would have achieved diversity. Now, this perception is based solely on the idea of diversity and counting up those differences. In this case, it's around ethnic minorities. But if you go on a little further in the same article, the group that you belong to influences your perception about when we've been successful. So what that means is, depending on what group you're in, you're going to say we have achieved diversity or we haven't achieved diversity at different times along that continuum of change. I know you guys might have seen this before, where people don't see things as they are, they see things as we are. In other words, I'm going to be looking at diversity from a multi-dimensional perspective. So I'll be looking at diversity from a gender perspective. I'll be looking at diversity ethnically, so Black to white. That's my perspective. I'm also biracial. So my mother's from the Philippines and my father's Black here from the United States. So I tend to also look at both of those groups. I tend to look at the Pan-Asian representation and the African-American representation. And I look at the other areas, but not with the same level of natural curiosity. So it takes some effort for us to start to look at things and see things a little bit differently. So I want to give you all an opportunity to do that. And I know this isn't a situation where it's particularly interactive, but I want to show you something. So this is the diversity wheel. Now hold on, I'm going to hide it. I'm going back a slide. Here's what I want you all to do. I want you to look at this slide, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds, and then I'm moving the slide away again. And what I want you to do is I want you to look at the different categories and areas of diversity. And I want you to just pick very quickly the 5 that you think are best descriptive of how you view yourself. Okay, you ready? Go. So which 5 of these areas really resonate with how you see yourself? All right. Strange to have a lot of quiet time on a webinar. All right, I'm going to stop it because I don't want people to linger here too much. So what I love about the diversity wheel is that it talks about internal and external, socioeconomic, geographic differences, all of these types of differences. And what I love about this activity is that some of us will naturally gravitate toward one area versus another. So for example, I immediately looked at ethnicity. I looked at geographic location. There's more to that story, but in the interest of time, I won't share it. But the reason that this matters is that was all about my self-view. Now I want you to do this again. And I want you to think about that new hire that just walked in and you're meeting them for the first time. Or you're going out to a client meeting. You're going out to a meeting with a prospective client. You're going out to do the sales pitch and you walk in the room I want you to look at this slide again, and now I want you to pick if I were to ask that person to give me 5 descriptors for you, which ones would they pick? So I'm not going to give you as much time. Remember, this is from the perspective of the other person describing you. So which ones would they pick? Now, this is going to lead us naturally into the next poll question, because what I want you guys to think about in this poll is whether or not the way you see yourself versus the way you think others perceive you is exactly the same, similar, it's a little bit similar, it's kind of different, or it's very different. So can we go ahead and launch that poll? I'm curious to see what the results are.
Yep, let's get this poll launched. So how do you see yourself versus how others might perceive you? And again, a reminder, if you're in full screen, just minimize so you can get the poll question submitted.
You know, Jina, looking at this question, I would kind of answer for myself somewhat similar. I feel like, you know, there are a lot of things, like you showed that slide, you know, just the tip of the iceberg. But I think in all aspects of my life, personally and professionally, I feel like there would be some things that people wouldn't assume about myself. I know, just saying that, not as an attendee, but just as somebody who's also, you know, who's also on the webinar today.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you do this activity in person, you tend to get a different result. This is a tougher one to do virtually. One of the things that's important to remember as we do this activity is if I'm inherently going to see this differently, going through the exact same example I gave, if I'm walking into a meeting with a prospective client, it depends entirely on that prospective client because I'm a woman of color. And so we have to take the results of this poll with a grain of salt because depending on what you were imagining was on the other side of that desk when you walked in the room will influence whether they see you the same or they see you very differently.
Absolutely. All right, Sharon, we're at 92% here.
Yep, I was going to say, so we're going to be closing this poll. If you haven't voted, this is your last chance. I'm closing in 3, 2, 1. And Jina, here's our results.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because it's mostly the somewhat category, and it's whether it's half full or half empty, but it's still right in the middle there. And I think this makes sense. And this is, every time I've done this activity, it tends to come out the same. And that's because our self-view is inherently different. There's a lot of things that we see in ourselves that aren't outwardly visible to others. And the only way somebody would know about it is because we have a relationship or we're communicating and talking about it, or it shows itself, for example. I'm looking around my, you guys might notice, oh, look, there, I'm back on camera.
Sorry.
That's okay. You guys might notice that over here, I have a little notebook, and there's no way for you to notice it, but very clearly, but it has a Southwestern design on it. There are some who might notice that and take a cue from that about what my ethnicity might be. So there are lots of different things that we will do overtly and implicitly to try to see difference in others. So let's move on and let's talk about those different ways that we see each other and how that shows up and manifests itself in this perspective of the outcome of a D&I strategy being inclusion, right? Well, what does inclusion mean? So we have two things that we measure. We measure uniqueness, which is what makes you different. So think style, thinking, background, gender identity, ethnicity, socioeconomic group. What are your superpowers? And I don't mean whether you can fly. What I mean is, what are your natural strengths? If anybody's ever done the Gallup's Strengths Finder, I went back and looked at mine just before going on the air. And mine are responsibility, ideation, futuristic, adaptability, strategic. And the combination of those things, the soup that those things put together make, that's me. And it's uniquely different for me. So how my uniqueness is appreciated in my organization is what we're measuring here on this vertical axis. Across the top is belongingness. And belonging is something we all, as humans, are wired to do. We are pack animals. We find safety in numbers. We naturally gravitate toward being in a group. And when we're in a group, we kind of want to be in the middle of the group. And not as in the center focus, but we want to be safely in the center of the pack because it's dangerous to be on the outside of the pack. So what does this mean then? If you look at it from a low belonging, low uniqueness perspective, we have what's called exclusion. So I'm not an insider in the group and my differences aren't really valued. In fact, it might be my differences that are causing me to be excluded. But if we stay on that side and go to high uniqueness, even though I'm not part of the group, this isn't necessarily a bad place to be because it's differentiation. This is, I am respected for what I know, even if I don't get invited to happy hour. Now, we all want to be invited to happy hour, but there are a lot of us, particularly in our profession, and yeah, I'm stereotyping a little bit, but we're okay with being the respected outsider. And if you're an auditor and you're constantly working on site at a client, it's hard to ever be an insider at the client. It's also hard to be an insider at the firm when you're out at the client more than you're in the office. And so differentiation is actually, I think in our profession, a safe and comfortable place to be. If you go the other direction, so we have high belonging, but low uniqueness, that is, I'm a part of the group so long as we ignore the things that make me different. That's called assimilation. And assimilation is really about covering, it's about conforming, it's about swallowing my individuality for the sake of the group. That's not necessarily bad. And so that's what I want to share though, is there are some dangers in assimilation. The danger is you don't really know who I am, or you might not understand the impact you're having on me. And I'm speaking generically here because assimilation happens in all groups. A woman, the only one in a room of men. A man, the only one in a room of women. A minority, the only one in a room of people who are white regardless of gender. Somebody with a disability in a group of with people who appear to be able-bodied. The only veteran in the room. The only boomer in the room. It doesn't matter. When you're the only, you tend to naturally cover up those things. And so the other people might not really know you, even though they think they know you. What does it cost though? What is the cost to the person who has to assimilate? So I showed on the screen, you saw code switching, which means talk differently depending on whom I'm around. Psychological safety means I'm only going to show aspects of you if I think it's safe, and I'm not going to risk being excluded from this group. Holding back means I'm not going to say something because I'm afraid if I do, I won't get the ... promotion, opportunity to be on that engagement, invited to happy hour, whatever the case may be. And I keep going to happy hour because that social connection is very important, and yet it tends to not be listed very high on priorities. But if you are, I'm trying to think, I had a conversation with a client, and this client is located in, I don't remember what state, but it's north of New York, one of the little states. And where this client is located, they're predominantly white. And even though their business is diverse, their business is scattered. So, but where they're headquartered is predominantly white. And trying to attract people to move to that place, to work there physically for roles that require that they are in the headquarters area, it's challenging, not because the firm or the company isn't diverse, but because the local community isn't diverse. And so that's important to recognize that that social piece is a critical part of what creates that connectivity to the firm, if I can socially be part of the group. And then the last one is the emotional tax, and this is the cumulative effect of all of this stuff. So the thing about it is, what I'm talking about people not understanding the impact they're having on those are blind spots. We all have them, but they're things that we can overcome, and they're things that we can work through. The challenge here is we have to talk about those differences, and talking about those differences is hard, mostly because we were all raised to be polite, and it feels like if I'm talking about somebody's difference, I'm calling somebody out, I'm targeting somebody. That's uncomfortable. There are a lot of conversations now, there are a lot of presentations and trainings around how to have an uncomfortable conversation. That's not what this training is about, but I bring it up because in order to develop a diversity strategy, in order to identify priorities around diversity and inclusion, we have to be able to talk about diversity and inclusion. And talking about diversity and inclusion without solely focusing on the numbers means talking about the social parts of it and talking about people's identity. And that's a very uncomfortable thing to talk about. Race, gender, gender identity, ability, or disability as we call it, because most disabilities, as they're classically referred to, I think something about 70% are invisible. So we talk about diversity thinking we're talking about somebody else without realizing you might actually be talking about me. So understanding that is important. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I want to put this context out there. This isn't an unconscious how to have uncomfortable conversations training, but I think the reason I want to include this here is in order for you to have conversations about diversity strategy, identifying priorities, determining groups and things of that nature, you still have to be comfortable talking about diversity. And there's an entire training you can also take around the language of diversity and inclusion, understanding the terminology, really understanding the difference between equity, equality, fairness, because they're very different things, and the implications of those words on culture. So I don't have time to go into those today, but I share them because how we talk and the language of our work in the D&I space matters. So this is about understanding how does what you say or do, your behaviors affect other people. Now, the example I'm going to give here is really about the spoken word, but it can also be about behavior or action. So let's talk about what you mean versus what they heard. Let's say you say to somebody, hey, let me do that for you. You're struggling with it. You're having a hard time. I can do that. I can help you. Here's the thing. You intend to be helpful. It doesn't matter what you say. It only matters what they hear. I hope that makes sense. And let me give you an example. If this other person heard, you need help, you mean you think I need help because I'm stupid? That might not have been what you intended. That's just how I heard it. That's how it landed on me. That's how I took it. So you're having an unintended impact on somebody else, and it's going to then influence the way you can continue in that conversation. This is really important, particularly if you have a lot of different people in the room and you're trying to talk about diversity and you say something that has an unintended impact on somebody else. It could shut them down. They could become defensive. They could start being reactive. You could start being reactive. You could start getting emotional. I know I've gotten emotional in these conversations. And hey, hold on a second. I didn't add this part about the filters. Similar people might still be seeing things differently because of our filters. My filter might be because of my socioeconomic background or the types of education that I have, or I might have had a traumatic experience in my childhood that is influencing the way I'm interpreting things today. This also, the dynamic changes depending on who you're talking to. You notice I just changed the headshot on the right from a man to a woman. The dynamics of that conversation are different. And so that is the challenge around talking about diversity and inclusion. Now, I used to serve on the National Commission for Diversity and Inclusion at the AICPA, or the NCDI. And one of the things I've totally stole from them, and I invite you to steal it from me, is this phrase at the beginning of all meetings: suspend your right to be offended. In order to have conversations around diversity, we have to be willing to let the uncomfortable thing be spoken and trust that the intention is there. So that's very important. So we start with notice and understanding the impact we have on others, seeing the differences that are in the room, and then we start working on awareness. Because as we become more aware, we can start having or engaging in those uncomfortable conversations. Two things we have that we define as real-time awareness, which is noticing that you are uncomfortable in the moment. Noticing you're uncomfortable in the moment. Then, once you notice that you're uncomfortable, collaborate in conflict is being able to stay engaged despite that discomfort. I just noticed I'm the only woman in the room. Ugh, I become uncomfortable with that. It might cause me to hold back. The skills of collaborate in conflict allow me to set that aside and continue the conversation. Let's talk about communicating intention. Then we go back to that. I want to be helpful. First off, if you rephrase that another way, how about you say, I'm happy to help you. If you need me, I'm here. I've done something like that before. I know how hard it can be. Let me know if I can help. Then the impact might be more consistent with your intention. And so while collaborate in conflict is really to the first example, somebody said something that was like a verbal poke in the eye, and I still have to stay present and engaged without being defensive. That's a collaborate in conflict skill. Improving my awareness as the person speaking, I might minimize the need for somebody else to have to do that to work with me. So this gets us to the last section of the inclusion framework, and this is the inclusion, which is the people who feel like they belong feel that way because they are invited to happy hour, even though they're kind of quirky. And that's a bit of an extreme example, but the bottom line is they are a respected member of the group and valued for the differences that they bring to the group. Assimilation was the old way of thinking about it. Many corporate cultures in America, not just in CPA firms, really looked at assimilation because we were all trying to be the same. It just makes work easier. But today we know inclusion is the goal. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, inclusion is the experience that we're going after. We achieve that by a culture of belonging. And so when you're thinking about your diversity strategy and you're thinking, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? It's important to have something like this in mind where everybody belongs. That's when you go back to those benefits of an organization. You get to realize those benefits of diversity because people feel like they fit in, because people feel comfortable and actually enjoy working in a room with lots of different people. That's when productivity increases. I think it was 61% said one of the benefits that they would like to enjoy from diversity is increased innovation. Innovation requires creativity. Creativity requires psychological safety. Psychological safety is I'll say something because I feel safe and that it won't harm me in a way that could affect my career or my potential for promotion and things like that. I'm not going to share. I'm thinking back about an experience I had. I was in a meeting and we were sort of doing some brainstorming. And the person that was leading the meeting was also leading the thinking. And they kept throwing out ideas. And I noticed that other people in the room were starting to go, oh, yeah, sure. I could tell from body language and, the meeting after the meeting, I could tell that some people didn't necessarily agree with those ideas, but nobody wanted to challenge the boss. That's a dynamic of something that's called groupthink, separate conversation. But I remember I've never forgotten this meeting because I threw out an idea and it was a crazy idea, but I felt safe enough to share it. And I also prefaced it by saying, okay, this is a crazy idea, and I shared it. Turns out that's the idea that was the nugget that we then collectively built on as a group. We didn't use my idea, but I think my idea was the spark that started what ended up being a really cool brainstorming session. I say that because in order to have that type of innovation, it goes all the way down to me feeling safe enough in the room to tell you my crazy idea. And I might be the youngest person in the room. I might be the only man in a room of all women. I might be the only Black person in a room of all white people. I might be the only white person in a room of all Hispanics. I should say Latinx. It is important because the long game here is recognizing the individuality of everybody in the room. I love this quote. Diversity is the art of thinking independently together. It's being able to tell you what I think. It's being able to show you how I feel. It's being able to behave in a way that is natural to me without feeling that it's going to put me at risk. So, all right, I don't know that we've had any questions coming in, but before we jump into the next section, so the third section is, all right, so we've talked about why this is important, and we've talked about what the long game is, it's belonging. Now we want to talk about, so how do you do this? How do you build a strategy? And I think the first thing I wanted to find out is, and I think this is the next polling question, Sharon. We want to launch that one.
Okay. This is, where are you currently in your diversity and inclusion strategic planning? You're just getting started. You don't have a strategy yet. Focused on initiatives. It's not really a full strategy. You're building out a strategy, or you're revising an existing strategy into something else. And Jina, we did have a question come in. Someone was asking that assimilation is definitely a high risk in larger firms or firms with little diversity. How do you help the group to accept of wonderful individuality and openness can be for the group and its growth? How do you get them to accept that?
Sorry, I had to mute myself. I was coughing. Can you repeat
yeah,
the last part of that question?
Yeah, the last part is like, how do you get the group to accept the wonderful individuality and openness, for the group and its growth with assimilation?
Oh, so why don't you guys just ask the easy questions? Can we have said that the easy questions, please?
Next question. Sorry, yeah.
Oh, but I think it's a fantastic question. Unfortunately, there's no short answer. What you're talking about is a function of two things: group dynamics, and groups tend to want to be efficient. And there are some natural ways that something starts to evolve called groupthink, where we all sort of think the same way. A good example is somebody says something, and if nobody disagrees, well, then we must all agree. That's not necessarily true. But in the effort for all of us to just get along and be efficient, we tend to shut things down. So there's some dynamic there to explore. The other thing is to explore something called unwritten rules. And unwritten rules are the things you have to do to be successful in an organization. They're just not written down anywhere. So for example, I was doing some training with a client recently, and through the chat, a comment came in that's, so one person was asking a couple questions and sharing some feedback. I happened to structure that event so that the chat was anonymous, so people could tell me what they really thought without risk. And somebody sent me a comment in the chat about, well, I'm going to make up a name. As long as Bob is hitting his sales numbers, he doesn't matter how he behaves. That's an example of an unwritten rule. So examining those kinds of things can help with that issue. And so that was a long answer to a question that's very difficult to answer without its own sort of subsection.
Mm-hmm.
But I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a good way to say that.
All right, so let's look at these responses, because I think these are fascinating and they're very helpful. So I see here 54% said they're just getting started and they don't have a strategy yet. 19% said they're looking more at trying to identify initiatives, not necessarily a full strategy. 10% are building out a strategy, and 17% are revising an existing strategy. Did I have another option there? Something else, but it doesn't look like anybody answered something else. So we're going to spend the next, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes or so. Oh, 6 minutes, 5 minutes. We're going to go through this really fast. And the good news is we don't need a ton of time for this. But no matter what you're doing, there's no wrong answer. That's the best part about all of this. So let's look at the resource that I'm going to share with you guys. It's from SHRM. This used to be the Society for Human Resource Management, but now it's just SHRM. I think that's what they go by. And their goal is to provide resources and to help provide excellence in leadership around human resource management, employment law, membership networking, continuing education, certification, things like that. And they have this tool, this how-to guide on how to develop a diversity, inclusion, and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. And there are 9 steps to this guide. And so this is what I wanted to walk you all through. And we're a smart group of CPAs. I think you can find this online. And I would encourage you to look at it and use it to try to identify those strategies. Step 1 is collecting the data. Now, collecting the data is what does your team look like? What are the different groups in your organization that you want to evaluate? Do you want to evaluate by service line, by level, by role? Do you have enough data? Is there data missing? For example, I had a client that wanted to do an assessment. It turns out they had race and gender, but they didn't have a gender identity. And they didn't collect the LGBTQ status because they were afraid that if they did, they might have exposed themselves to legal risk. So do you have enough data to hit the goals that you've set? What are the areas of concern? What are the things you're trying to address? And the best part about this is there's no wrong answer. D&I is a boil the ocean problem. And if you try to boil the ocean, you will fail. And the best thing to do is pick something and then iterate. You pick something and it helps you identify the next thing. So for example, here, if your area of concern is, I don't know, policy review, maybe you can start by developing a diversity statement, because in developing the statement, it will reveal to you areas of where you might be missing potential policies. So it's not a one and done answer. It's whatever makes sense and whatever feels right. The third step is addressing your policies and your practices that affect diversity. Do you have parental leave, or is it just you can only be a mother? Do you have work schedules that accommodate your different groups? Is there a dress code? I remember one time I was specifically told at a CPA firm that I was working in, not for, I couldn't wear pants. It was a long time ago, but is there a dress code that favors one group over the other, or might create discomfort for one group over the other? If you're looking at it from a legal compliance perspective, are you looking at it to minimize risk, or are you looking at it in terms of compliance? Identifying your business objectives. There are a number of objectives that you can be looking at, including recruiting and culture, but there's more than that, going back to branding and how you appear to recruits, recruiting strategy. So again, there's no wrong answer here. The best part about these 9 steps is just pick one. Any one of these are places that you can start. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here other than to share this is a great resource. They're a tax-exempt organization specializing in research, education, and tools to help improve D&I worldwide, D&I practices. They offer benchmarks. Benchmarks can help you determine how to measure. Benchmarks can help you identify where you have gaps. Benchmarks can help you see how you're doing compared to other people. They organize these benchmarks in these 4 different groups. 4 groups with 14 categories in them. And I found that reading through the benchmarks really helped me understand from I'm not doing anything to I'm demonstrating best practice. Looking at those really helped me go, oh, I can see where there's opportunity for improvement. Procedure, getting buy-in and support. The thing about buy-in and support is that there's from everybody. You want to get it from clients, you want to get it from employees, you want to get it from leadership, you want to get it from HR. One of the things you might want to consider doing is starting, if you haven't already, a D&I task force or a committee to help inform the development of a strategy, identification of initiatives that attack the priorities that you have, as well as developing the strategy itself, and then monitoring the strategy. All right, so our last polling question, because I know you have to answer all of them, and I'm so sorry, I'm looking at the time, I tracked the time wrong. The 4th poll is, which of the following do you have regarding D&I? Do you have defined goals? Do you have a defined business objective, measurable data, leadership buy-in, or none of the above?
All right, looks like everybody's answering that question now. While everyone's answering the poll question, Jina, we did have a couple questions that did come in. So I guess we'll begin some of the question and answer.
Sure.
And we'll go a touch over the 3 o'clock mark here because we do have some great questions that came in. CC asked, should the importance of D&I be communicated to senior leaders to make sure that they do it right and it's not purely a branding thing? So something that's kind of just done for show, I guess is where she's coming from there.
Absolutely. So one of the step 7 in this strategy initiative and the how-to guide is communicating initiatives. It's important to communicate internally and externally and at all levels. What you say to different groups doesn't have to be the same, but you should be saying something to every group. So speaking to leadership, speaking to all employees, speaking to legal, talking to clients, talking to recruits, talking to new hires. Sharing information publicly and transparency above all else is a best practice.
All right, great. We'll move down to Darlene's question here, and this is again on recruiting practices, but how do you address diversity if resumes are non-diverse or qualified people are non-diverse?
So in that case, there are a couple things. First, where are you getting resumes from? So it's looking at your recruiting policies. Is a question of resources. Are you using a website, or are you using a third-party service, or are you only going to certain schools? So that's part of it. And then it's how are you assessing candidates? What is your policy or your process for assessing candidates? Because back in the day, we would say we want to hire the quote unquote best people. But what is best? And historically, that had meant people like me. So I think that's a question of where you're looking for candidates and how you're assessing candidates. And there's a lot of good new tools out there on how to do that in ways that are more blind or ways that pull in candidates that are more diverse.
Got it. And then we have one more down here. Do you think inclusion goes both ways in that all groups need to see themselves as one of the group instead of somebody who is different? So I guess in that way, it's people, I guess, of all different backgrounds. How does that really more of a leadership or a policy initiative? How would you see that?
I don't think I understood the question. By the way, I don't know if you want to publish these poll results so everybody can see. Can you read that question again?
Yes, absolutely. Well, we will read the question after this. So it looks as if we have 47% said none of the above. So that definitely something we'll hope to be working on. 30% leadership buy-in, 12% said defined business objectives. Real quick, I'll actually ask a question of my own here. Do you find that in today's current social climate, companies, not just in the accounting industry, but all over, are sort of having a reckoning with like wanting to be more diverse and wanting to be more actionable and wanting to have sort of a CSR, a corporate social responsibility campaign implemented on their side?
I would say that from where I sit, and so I've been working with clients in government, in non-public accounting, and then in public accounting, that it depends, it varies. I worry that there is a temporary uptick in this, but we won't see lasting change. The good news is I'm starting to see leadership across all industries acknowledging that they play an important role, because a lot of D&I efforts have been grassroots, but now without the top-down approach, you can only go so far from a grassroots effort.
I got it. Well, that concludes the questions that we had here in the questions tab, and that does also conclude the presentation. Jina, I think I speak for everybody here saying that this was a really, really interesting discussion. I'm glad that a lot of our attendees participated as well. I thank you so much for joining us today, and you're always welcome back for our expert webinar series. We have your information right here, your mobile phone number, and then your email is jina@etiennecpa.com. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciated it.
Thank you for having me, and I apologize for running out of time here. And if anybody has questions, feel free to ping me on email. If you do, just make sure you put in your subject line that you're following up on the email in case you end up in the spam folder.
No worries at all. Let me just share my screen really quick. I want to promote our next expert webinar series presentation, and that's with my supervisor, Div Bonsali. He is the Vice President of Marketing here at Accountants World, and he'll be talking about marketing your firm's services in uncertain times. I can say for a fact that I've worked with Div for a number of years, and he is definitely a marketing guru. In addition to being a Vice President of Marketing here at Accountants World, he's also an adjunct professor at University of North Carolina. So He is really sharp and will give you a lot of great tools in order to market your firm's services. And that'll be taking place on Wednesday, November 4th at 2 p.m. And you can sign up for his and the rest of the Expert Series webinars at 2020-webinars.com. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We hope we could see you on November 4th. And thank you so much again to Jina. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Jina, just real fast, the email was jina@etienneconsulting.com.
It's Jina at atncpa.com, but you can find me on LinkedIn, and on LinkedIn, you should get a link to my email there.
Perfect.